Hello, folks. Welcome to the Dusty Trails and Tall Tales podcast on the Great American Western YouTube channel. We're here today with a very special guest, Joanne Fralick. She
Hi.
is, she is the writer behind the Cournoyer Brothers trilogy, and her latest book, Requiem for a Rustler, continues the story of the brothers as they navigate lawlessness, loyalty, and their Lakota heritage in the untamed frontier of the 1880s. But this isn't just a Western story. It's a deeply rooted story in real genealogical research that uncovered fascinating connections to real life outlaws, lawmen, and historical events. Joanne, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Could you tell us a bit more about yourself and what draws you to writing Westerns?
Well, as you already mentioned, for a long time I've been a genealogist. I've been a writer all my life, print journalist for over 40 years, and I currently write for an online international construction magazine. Um, During COVID, I really dug into the genealogy, and I discovered a branch of my French Canadian family who immigrated to Missouri, down the Missouri River, sorry, to South Dakota, and during the fur trade, intermarried with the Lakota Sioux tribe, and stayed there. And there's a very large branch of the family down there. Now, originally the name was Cournoyer, French Canadian.
Hmm.
In Canada, in Ontario, we changed the pronunciation and the spelling to Cournoyer. In South Dakota, they kept the original French Canadian spelling, changed the pronunciation to Cournoyer. Yeah, but that's how I got into westerns. Like I've written a lot of local history. I've dabbled in children's books. I put out a genealogy book on my family. Um, But the Western came about when I discovered this branch of the family because there was one particular niche of three, oh, there were actually four brothers, but the three oldest in particular, who were in the newspapers, in the media of the day a lot because they were cattle rustlers and horse thieves. And they ran with a gang called the Jack Sully gang. Jack Sully is rather well known in South Dakota. He's infamous as being kind of a Robin Hood type rustler.
Huh.
Mhm.
So, what inspired you to center it around the Cournoyer brothers? Because they were your ancestors, or?
Partially, yes. Definitely, the family connection made a difference, but they were the branch of the family who I was able to find the most factual information about in the media of the time, and just the whole when I dug into it, the whole story of their history and their background, why they did what they did, and the circumstances of the times and the issues with the indigenous people and the settlers, it just fascinated me. It really struck something in me because I didn't know anything about it.
Huh. So you wrote the story based off the genealogical research, and you didn't
Yes.
necessarily have an idea for the story.
Not until I did the genealogical research, and then when I started researching the newspaper clippings, the story kind of laid itself out. Now there
Mm.
are definitely parts that are pure fiction. I would say the series is based on a true story
Okay.
because there are, of course, like I have no idea what the real dialogue would have been. There's gaps of maybe of years where they've obviously gone into hiding, or they just were doing what they were doing and haven't weren't getting caught. They were staying under the radar, so nobody knows exactly. There's no reports of exactly what they were doing or where they were doing it. But there was enough in the media that I was able to pull together a pretty good skeleton of what was going on. And then when I discovered their prison records, they are actually run in twice.
Hmm.
And when I discovered their prison records and that they were accessible from Leavenworth with pictures, that opened up a whole new door. That really gave me the opportunity to figure out who these people were, um, what they were like. Like I found out through Philip, the youngest of the three's medical history, that he was not well. He was thin, he was consumptive, he had a lot of issues, a lot of health issues. I found out that Claude, the middle brother, when they went into Leavenworth, whenever prison, I don't know if they still do it now, maybe they do, but at the time, whenever an inmate was incarcerated at Leavenworth, they shaved them bald. It was for a couple
Wow.
of, it was for a couple of reasons. One, humiliation, because everybody back then was long haired, and two, head lice. Let's face
Yeah.
it, you know, medical things. But when they shaved Claude's head, it was extremely obvious in his mugshot that he had a severe head injury. Uh,
Wow.
Severe, like he was. And then when I dug into his medical records, it recorded that he had partial paralysis down one side because
Hmm.
of that injury. No idea how it happened, no record of how it happened. So, of course, I had to surmise, make up a story of how he got that injury. Uh,
Yeah.
So that part, the part of him getting the injury, is fiction, but I think plausible fiction, because we have no idea how old he was when it happened, what the circumstances were of it happening. But still, he had a 3 inch by 2 inch divot in his skull, like
Wow.
indentation, an actual indentation,
Hmm.
um, and it affected him throughout his life. Probably caused him a lot of pain. Probably got migraines like crazy.
Yeah.
You can imagine the suffering that somebody would go through that would have an injury like that back then. I mean, even today, a head injury like that is hard to treat,
Yeah. It's a
and
wonder he survived it.
they had nothing. Yeah, yeah.
Well, how do themes of loyalty, betrayal, and cultural preservation shape the characters and the plots in your writing?
Well, the loyalty, of course, because I'm a genealogist, is familial loyalty, and the brothers were very, very loyal to their own family, to their culture. But Jack Sully was not native. His wife was. His wife Mary was. Jack was not. Jack possibly came from Canada, possibly came from New York. We don't really know, because the Sully name has been hard. His name has been hard to trace. It's possible that maybe at some point along the line, from him starting out wherever and coming to South Dakota, that he changed his name to Sully.
Yeah.
So we don't know if that's even is his original real name. But he formulated this gang, and a big part of his reason for formulating the cattle rustling and horse stealing gang was to provide income for his Native American neighbors who had pretty much lost everything.
Hmm.
So the Native Americans around him in the Rosebud Reserve, and to another extent the Pine Ridge Reserve, which is a little further west, where he fenced a lot of his animals, were loyal to him because he wasn't seen as the enemy to them. Not really a savior either, because he did know enough for a long time not to mess in his own backyard, but unfortunately towards the end kind of got a little messy there. And but the men were totally devoted to him. If something happened to one of them, he looked after their families. If a family was in need, if he heard about a local family in need, he made sure they had something to eat.
Yeah.
Um, so that's where the loyalty comes in. The native culture just naturally came from my research of the Lakota Sioux culture and what was going on in the Indigenous community at the time. Very eye opening. Very eye opening. So I tried that. That was the hardest part of writing this book. The very much most difficult part of writing this was trying to stay true and honest to and treat their culture fairly, because I'm not part of it. I'm the first
Yeah.
one to admit I'm white. I'm white. I'm French Canadian. I have no Indigenous blood directly in me. My relationship to the Cournoyer brothers is through one of my ancestors marrying an Indigenous woman.
Uh,
So I was very carefully treading and doing a lot of research, asking a lot of questions. I made some wonderful connections in the Indigenous community in South Dakota, both with distant cousins and members of the Sully family and educators who I hope I'd pass passages and parts of the story through them and say, did I do this right? And is this offensive? Is this inaccurate? And I got really good feedback from people, and everybody was encouraging and welcoming. And I can't say enough good about the Indigenous community in Yankton and the Rosebud. They're great people, and they were very welcoming, and they really helped me out a lot. And they really made the book. They really made a difference in how it was written.
you did some travels in your to do your research, didn't you?
I did. Never been out there before, but 2 years ago we spent a couple of weeks in South Dakota. We started in I guess Sioux Falls, and just worked our way west right to the Black Hills. Now, most of the relevance, of course, to my family would have been around the Missouri River, closer to the Missouri River, but we didn't want to see, everything. It was an interesting trip. Saw my first longhorn cow, saw my first buffalo, wild buffalo. Saw the Badlands. That was amazing. Absolutely amazing. And stopped in a lot of the little towns that are mentioned in the book because they were mentioned in the news articles. Burke, nice little town. Winter, um,
Did you
Murdo.
stop in Deadwood?
Went to Deadwood, went to Sturgis. Didn't make it down to Custer, unfortunately. Deadwood, while it was, pardon me, interesting to see the terrain and the town, I didn't find pertaining to the research that I was doing. I didn't really find it relevant, unfortunately, because I found actually what was more relevant and was a lot more value to me was a place on the way to Deadwood, just west of Murdo, called 1880s Town, where they filmed part of Dances with Wolves.
Well,
It was a big help because they had a lot of building structures and history there that was pertinent to the time frame. So when I had to describe the brothers getting incarcerated in the local jail, they had a local jail set up there with the sheriff's office and the desk and the little jail cell and what the whole building looked like and what the inside of the cell what they would have had or not had in there. And that made a big difference. And then, of course, they had a general store. They had, just like a little town set up, the little rail line. It really, really helped me. Really, really helped me.
can you share more about the story of Seth Bullock that you found when you were
That
doing
that
some
was
research?
that was the one highlight of visiting Deadwood. My husband and I, we were just kind of wandering around town, and we decided to, because I knew there was a connection, I decided to go up to Mount Moriah Cemetery and see Wild Bill's grave. And while we were there, a tourist group came along, a tour group, and the tour leader, the tour guide, was talking, doing his spiel. We just happened to be right there, and we're listening to him. And he had mentioned, after he just did the discussion about Wild Bill's grave and Calamity Jane's, he said, "Oh, and by the way, if you want to walk up the hill," it was a bloody hot day, so we didn't. It was a bloody hot day, and if you want to walk up the hill a bit there, then you can see Seth Bullock's grave. Seth Bullock is buried in here. And I kind of muttered something about, "Oh yeah, Seth Bullock, big deal." And he kind of looked at me like, well, Seth Bullock is kind of a local hero. And I'm like, he ran in my cousins. I just about fainted. And he said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "Yeah." I pulled out my research book and I showed him the pages and the genealogy, and I tracked it all down in the newspaper articles. He says, like, "In all the years I've been doing this, I have never met anyone with any connection to anyone in this graveyard, any of the famous people buried in this graveyard." So I'm sure there must be more people out there that are, but it was kind of
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. But Seth ran my cousins into Leavenworth when Leavenworth was built. It was ready for its first intake of prisoners. They were in the Sioux Falls Penitentiary, where they were going to spend their incarceration. But then they built Leavenworth, and when they did the first 34-person prisoner transfer to Leavenworth, Seth Bullock accompanied the 34 prisoners. My three cousins were part of. My three ancestors were part of that transfer. He accompanied the transfer on the train.
Well, we've got a slideshow I was going to show on the screen with some of your ancestors, and we could
There we
talk
go.
about them.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is Claude Cournoyer. He is the middle brother. He's the one that has the terrible head wound. That is actually his first mugshot from when prisoners were in the early days when they were incarcerated. When they got their mugshot, they wore their street clothes.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's Claude. He's
Okay.
he's the middle. This is John. He's the oldest brother. He is the only one actually of the three who died a natural death. Um, he was the oldest brother. He after Jack Sully, the ringleader of the gang, was killed in an ambush by a posse, led by Sheriff Marshal Petrie. He took over the gang. He was their treasurer, and he kept the gang going until his second incarceration. He lived a good long life. He died in 1967 or 8, and he was in his 90s.
Oh,
Mm-hmm. This is Philip. Philip was a bit of a philanderer. He's the youngest brother. He was a, he. This is his first incarceration picture. He was also the one in poor health. You can see he's kind of thin. He's a smaller guy. Um, Philip liked the ladies. Philip
what
liked
about
the ladies. Philip met his end at the wrong end of a gun by a jealous husband.
what about this photo?
This is the Cournoyer homestead. It's still standing. It is near Burke, South Dakota. Is on the Rosebud. It's amazing that it's still standing. That building is well over 100 years old. Well over 100 years old. I found it very interesting, the style that it was built in. Like that's a very low, single story, small windows. Um, Only 2 rooms inside. Um, I wish I had been able to see it in person. The gentleman that's standing in the picture there, Bill, him and his daughter went out there and took these photos for me 3 years ago. We tried when we were out there visiting a couple of years ago. We tried to get there, but it had been a wet summer, and we just couldn't get through the muck. We couldn't get the car through the muck to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, very very interesting. And again, these photos. He took a lot of photos for me. He took photos of the family grave where the brothers and their father are buried. And it's just across the Ponca Creek from there.
Yeah.
And the very valuable information that for making the story more realistic.
Uh,
Uh, Jack Sully's grave. Jack Sully was buried, and there's a couple other family members there in a little family cemetery. There's nothing else there now, but it would have been on his ranch. Shortly after he was killed, actually less than a year after he was killed, um, their homestead was bought by a settler, and all the buildings were torn down, and then the property was resold, and there was a big sanitarium spa built there by a doctor.
well,
And even that is gone now. There are no buildings around there at all. But if you know where to look, if you go with somebody that knows they can, and you look off in the distance, you can still see the location where he was gunned down, if you know where to look. It's not marked, but by the description of the terrain, it's pretty obvious. You can see where it happened. But
And how does the story? How do you break up the story between the trilogies? Like, is it like each book a sequel, or is it one long continuous story?
it's one long continuous story. From the start, from it goes from the start of when the boys were children and their father was a trader. He used to run freight between Pier and Deadwood, actually. Deadwood, Custer, Sturgis, all Belforge. Um, and it follows their story from when they were children through to John's death in the 1960s. Philip was the first of the three to go. The second was Claude. Circumstances for Claude's death. There's two different stories. Neither can be proven. Neither can be refuted. But he died by gunshot as well. Like I said, John's the only one that lived out his natural life. John was also the only one that was married of the boys. Actually, of the four boys, the oldest was John. Then came Claude, then Phil, and then there was a younger brother, Charlie, who stayed on the homestead and didn't really get involved as much. But I did bring Charlie into the story because it was a useful plot
Yeah.
plot twist. So train of thought derailed. But yeah, it's all one long story. I wrote it as one long story originally, and then broke it into three because it was my publisher, Dusty Saddle, figured it'd be more manageable
Yeah.
for a reader to put it into three shorter story bites than one great big long. I'm not competing with Lonesome Dove. There's no way. I'd love
Yeah.
to be that good, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, these stories delve into like cattle rustling and law evasion. How do you balance historical accuracy with creative storytelling in those kind of scenarios?
Historical accuracy was important to me, but the main thing that was the main thing is driving the plot and keeping it interesting. So I tried to keep the theme. I believe is historically accurate. It's what it was for the times. The trick was because it's right at the end of the Great Western era, the Great Western Development era. There's a lot of things coming in that you wouldn't have seen in, say, Dances with Wolves, or we would have read about in Lonesome Dove, because I was taking a time period mostly from mid 1880s to, for the most part, 1920.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of change. That's a lot of change. The Industrial Revolution, mass settlement. Pretty much by the time the boys were already old enough to get into cattle wrestling, the buffalo were already gone. The reserves had already been laid out, and all the treaties had already been settled. So I did get quite, of course, the dialogue. I had to get creative with the dialogue because no one knows what they said, but I tried to keep it period accurate, the lingo, and I tried to bring some indigenous culture into it.
Yeah, I've noticed you have a couple of indigenous words in the first book.
Yes. My cousins helped me out with that.
Yeah.
One cousin in particular, his name is Gerald Cournoyer, and he is a very well educated man. He's a university professor. He has several degrees, and he's a fine artist. It does Indigenous art, beautiful stuff, beautiful stuff. And he was really the one that kept me on the straight and narrow, and told me a lot. He actually told me a lot. He was very open about his own experiences in boarding school and Indigenous schools. A couple of the other family members were very open about that. Really went a long way with the accuracy. I tried to stay accurate as much as I could while keeping it interesting, because I didn't want it to be a history book. I didn't want it to be a lecture. I want it to be a story.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any cultural insights that
Oh
you
God,
were shared by your cousins that helped you in
a
the
lot,
story and
a
characters?
lot, a lot. Yeah, it was. There were parts that were very difficult. There were parts that were very. The family connections were eye opening. They are all about family, extended family, and the consideration for the seniors and their family. Again, one of the key people that I talked to, unfortunately, he passed 6 months after. He actually passed before the first book came out, which was really sad. My cousin Thurman from Yankton. He lived in a little town. Him and his family came to a little town called Marty, on the near the Missouri River, and he told me a lot about the older ways and the way that they were treated and the way that they lived their lives in the 40s and 50s. And then Gerald told me about what it was like going to Indigenous schools in the 60s and 70s. And that was eye opening. Actually, I knew nothing other than what I saw in the news. I knew nothing about the Indigenous schools and the boarding schools.
Yeah.
That was very eye opening, and
A lot of that
I reflected that in the books. I told their truths in the books.
Yeah, a lot
Yeah,
of that native schools sort of get swept under the rug in the history books. Nobody likes to talk about it.
no, that's the thing. That's the more I learned about it, the more I realized that this was going on right around me when I was a kid in Eastern Ontario going to school. I lived near a large Mohawk reserve called Tyendinaga, and I had no idea there was any such thing as Indigenous schools. I wondered, it's like, well, how come, like these kids are like right next door to me? How come we never see them? I didn't
Yeah.
know. I didn't know they were segregated.
Well, how does your background in journalism affect how you approach writing historical fiction?
I think it helps a lot in research, because a lot of journalism and investigative journalism is all about research and accuracy and digging and proving answers from more than one source. It really made a big difference with the research, and I'm not afraid to ask people questions. I like to think I'm good at asking the right questions. Um, and just the writing process, just knowing that the writing process takes time. First time that you do it, the first time you put it on paper, it's going to be garbage. You got to go over it many times before you get what you want. And even then, after any of my works are published, I can go back through. I'll go back through them, and I'll say, "Oh, I should have changed that. Well, I shouldn't have done that." But hey, you do your best. You get to a point where you do whatever you can, the best that you can, and the rest of it you just have to let go.
Yeah.
Best.
Well, this your first publication, or
This is my
have you
first
written any other
Western.
books?
This is my first Western, and I don't think it's going to be my last. Honestly, I really don't. I'm liking the genre. I never thought I would. I was not a huge fan of Western books or movies. I mean, I've watched some of the classics,
Yeah.
but I do like it now. I do like the genre now a lot.
Is there anything that surprised you about it after you began writing in it?
Yeah, about the genre.
Yes,
Yeah,
about West.
the length of the stories is a lot shorter than I thought they'd be. Like the 60,000 word book um, is 40 to 60,000 seems to be the norm. And I was used to writing stuff that was a lot longer than that. I was used to writing a minimum of 85,000. So I've written, like I say, my genealogy book was a 300-page book, but a lot of that, of course, is family history charts.
Yeah.
Uh, Children's book was fairly short. I did a lot, and I've also done a local history book called, from the community where I'm from, called 70 Years of Camp Picton.
Yeah.
And it was about a British Commonwealth air training camp that I actually live on. Um, that was active during training British and Australian pilots during the Second World War.
Well,
Yeah, that was my
so
first venture into actual book publication.
uh,
Yeah.
so if you write another western, will it be about your ancestors, or do you have
Yes.
ideas for random random
No,
topics?
no. I'm going to stick with what I know, and what I'm thinking of actually is a prequel.
Ah,
Going back to when my ancestor Bruno Cournoyer traveled down the rivers, across the Great Lakes, and down the Missouri River to South Dakota to start a new life. He left home when he was 18 because his father passed, and he was the oldest male. And it was his job to get out and find and make a living. I see. I got a question from Mike. How many hours a day do I write? I write my novel probably no more than an hour a day, maybe even only a half hour, but I write 8 hours a day because I write for a living for the construction magazine that I write for. So my work writing cuts off a lot of my time for my enjoyment writing, my pleasure writing. But
yeah.
I still get some in, and on my days off I'll write 3-4 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's sporadic. Right now, because I'm wrapping up the book 3, it's going to be done in about a month or so. Um, I'm like I said, I'm doing research. I'm starting to research now for the prequel. Um, I've also got a couple of other projects that I'm going to pick at, and it'll depend on which one actually seems to show the most progress is the one that I'll probably pursue first. I'm hoping the Western prequel will be the first one that I work on. But I'm also thinking about Dusty Saddle also has a division that does horror. And I don't want to compare myself to Stephen King. I would nowhere they're that good, but I wouldn't mind trying it. I like switching genres. I like just stretching and trying new things. But I might have a go at a vampire novel because I wrote for a company back in the 1990s that produced vampire books.
Uh,
So that would kind of be going back to my writing roots. And I'm also kind of kicking around the idea of a another children's book. Because again, the children's book that I wrote tied in with the history book that I wrote. Um, and I could make a series out of it if I wanted to.
yeah.
Uh, so you're kind of all over the place. Kind of all over the place.
Yeah. Well, the thing about westerns is you can combine all sorts of other genres with them as well. You can have horror
Yes.
westerns or
Hmm.
all kinds of different things.
Yep. Yeah, I've seen actually a genre that I find kind of interesting. I don't know if I'd write about it or not. I don't know if I have the skills or if it's my skill set, but the Weird West and kind of the
Yeah.
steampunk West, like Wild Wild West,
Yeah.
that's
That's
popular
pretty
too.
popular.
I like it. I like to read it. I like to read it. I like to watch movies about it too, but I don't know about writing it.
Yeah.
Couple of questions from Mike. What magazine do I write for? It's called Construction Source Magazine Australia, and it's online.
Yeah.
And I've been a writer. I've been a journalist since I was about 20 years old. Um, geez, am I telling my age? Over 40 years. Over 40 years.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And no,
Seems
not going to slow down. What writing is great. It's one of those things. It's not like sports. It's not one of those things you have to give up after you hit a certain age. It's something you can do as long as you stay sharp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said you weren't really that familiar with the westerns, but if you
No,
had to pick, say, a favorite movie, western movie, what would you pick?
Lonesome Dove.
Lonesome Dove.
Hands down, brilliant. Absolutely loved that miniseries. Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. My husband's over here in the cheering section saying Jeremiah Johnson.
Yeah,
That's his favorite.
yeah, that's
He's
a good one
actually
too.
my husband's been a huge help with me for all this because he is a big Western fan.
Oh,
So he's been able to help me out with a lot of things. Yeah,
yeah,
he's my muse.
yeah.
But yeah, it's a Lonesome Dove the whole way, and it's funny. I found some parallels with the Cournoyer brothers too. Again, kind of the family thing, and the character Newt. Surprisingly
Mhm.
enough, I have a in book 3. I have a young man coming into the story who was an orphan.
Yeah,
And again, I have the newspaper articles to back this up. And he lived with the brothers for a period of time and got involved with them. And I'm not going to say how that ended, but it did end.
yeah. So how did your first two books set up your third
Well,
and
the first,
final trilogy?
yeah, the first 2 books are mostly about their careers, their nefarious careers. Of course, and the third book is going to tie it all together and show how their careers ended and in different ways at different times, and how the times were affecting what they did and how they did it, not only as Indigenous people but just as being part of the Old West and losing that,
Hmm.
and having the modern society force them to change their ways as Indigenous people and as ranchers.
Hmm. What would be the most surprising thing you learned from your research that you hadn't expected?
Wow. Hmm. That's a good one. I think the scope of where they were active when they were rustling and the hardships that they would have gone through to do that. Um, it was hard enough to get by on the prairies in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah.
But to do it while staying under the radar and committing crimes and hiding out and having to do it year round, like some of the part of the research that I did that was really interesting was weather.
Wow.
There were a couple of very significant weather events that happened while my cousins were active, both with themselves and with the Sully gang. One was a particularly brutal winter where I think they said 90% of the stock animals on the prairies were killed in a storm. It happened in May, but it was snow and ice and slush, and it just devastated the industry, which was a bad thing for them because I mean it was a horrible loss. They had animals of their own, which they lost, but it was a boon for them as well because whatever they could rustle was worth a lot more.
Yeah.
So it kind of worked both ways. Ah, is a writing career or a career as lonely as they say it is? Hell no. I've got lots of writer friends. I reach out all the time. Uh, writing itself is you do it by yourself. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's it can be isolating, but I do not isolate myself. You can't learn anything if you isolate yourself. You can't. You have to expose yourself to people to learn how people talk, how people act, how people interact. Um, and you have to talk to other authors to stay on top of what's going on in the industry.
Have
Um,
you read any other westerns?
I'm sorry.
Have you read any other western novels or books, short
I've read
stories, or anything?
books. Yes, I have read a few books, mostly history books. Actually, there's a pretty good book out by gentleman by the name of Sweetland that's about Jack Sully called Rustler on the Rosebud. And that was the first one that I read when I started doing the research and um, discovering Jack Sully and the Cournoyer Brothers. And he was my first person that I reached out to talk to about the history and what was going on on the Rosebud at the time. I've read a few of the old pulps. I've read some of the really old stuff that is on uh, what is it called? It's not Google. It's Gutenberg. Gutenberg
Uh,
Press has a lot of free for use old westerns on there, and I've checked out a lot of those, and they're kind of fun again for learning about setting and language, clothing.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a lot of what the Western movies get wrong is clothing. That you
Yes. Hmm.
wouldn't realize that's a big thing they often get wrong.
Yes. Yes. Well, you figure these guys weren't wealthy. They didn't have all these fancy buckskins and shiny boots and shooting irons. They got what they could scrounge. And
Yeah,
it's very ordinary clothing. And again, the hair, actually a very difficult thing that I had to kind of sort out or figure out how I was going to do it was the brothers' hair. Because, of course, when they went to boarding school, they had their hair cut off, cut short,
yeah,
boys and the girls. But when they'd come home from boarding school for the summer, which these guys did, I know some of them stayed years round for whatever reason, these guys were able to come home. They'd let the hair grow. And I assumed that when they were done with school, they probably just let their hair go. But as you can see from the mugshots, they had short hair when they went to prison because, of course, they would have been made to get a fresh haircut to be presentable in front of the judge when they had their hearing.
yeah,
So that's something I had to be very conscious of, is if I was describing their hair whipping in the breeze because they were riding their horse away from a posse. I had to okay, have they been out of jail long enough to have grown their hair? Have they been out of school long enough to have grown their hair? It was really something to think about. Yeah. But I got a couple of questions here. Am I a night owl or an early morning writer? Night owl.
yeah.
Oh, always been a night owl. Um, do I have to discipline myself to a schedule? No, I just let it flow naturally. If I'm in the mood to write, I write. If I'm not, I don't. Because if I'm not in the mood to write, and I try to force myself, I write garbage, and I have to start over anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do I hope to have a movie made of my book or books someday? Absolutely. That would be um,
What
that-
writer doesn't dream of
that's the
that?
bucket list, man. That's got to happen. I
Yeah,
absolutely want that to happen. I think it'd make a fabulous story. I kind of liken it to Killers of the Flower Moon because it brings in the native culture and the
yeah,
white culture and what was going on at the time. I think it would be amazing.
yeah.
Mm.
What do you think makes a compelling protagonist, and can how do your characters reflect that?
I think a compelling protagonist has to have a good mix of um, good qualities and not so good qualities. You can have a protagonist that's an absolute bad person, but you have to explain why it happened, why they're that way. I think the backstory is very important. Um,
Is there anything you want your viewers to know about you, or
ooh,
where they can find your
well,
books?
yeah, you can find my books on Amazon. Um, they are available both in physical paperback or for order either in physical paperback or by Kindle. Um, I go to local craft fairs and book shows and stuff. They are available locally, but I don't think you got too many of your viewers that are up where I am. Background wise, like I said, I'm a journalist. I'm still in Ontario, Canada. So if you're ever up this way, come to Picton. Come to Picton, and I'll autograph a book for you.
Yeah.
I see Mike's asking what makes a good villain.
No.
Well, I think a good villain, it has to be actually that has to have some good and some bad. I think again the background story and explaining the why, what motivates them, is what gets a reader to be invested in the character. Pure evil and pure good is boring.
Yeah.
There has to be some character conflict in there.
There's some shades of gray.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay.
Well, folks, that wraps up this episode of the Dusty Trails and Tall Tales podcast. A big thank you to Joanne for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your insights and the
Mm-hmm.
history and writing behind your series. Be sure to check out her books. You can find the links are in the description of the video.
Great.
And thank you again. And we'll see you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks again. And yeah, please check out my Facebook page, my website. Feel free to ask me any questions.
Alrighty.
Yeah. I'm always available to talk to other people that are into the genre.
Alrighty. Well, thank you. We'll see y'all later.